I'm from Poland, and for the past 6 years, I've been a member of one of the biggest paranormal investigation teams in my country. Sometimes people call to us and ask for help with things they think are paranormal. I've got a lot of cases, files, photos, and recordings of strange things, and possibly strange creatures. But this time, I'd like to tell you about one of the weirdest cases I've ever seen. It was 4 years ago. I lived along the Czech and German borders, in a mining community. One day I returned from work and saw an email from my HQ. They wanted me to investigate a call from a village, almost at the Czech border. It was some way away from me, but I lived closer to it than anyone else, so it was up to me. The call was about suspected ghost activity, not in one home, but in the entire village. Both the HQ and I thought it sounded like a poltergeist. I packed up ghost hunting equipment, and I got on my way. It took me about 2.5 hours to get to the place. When I arrived, I noticed how small and quiet the village was. There were only about 10 houses, no shops or even bus stops. I made a circle through the village, just for some fun and to catch the scenery. Then I went to the address the HQ had given me. It was a pretty wooden house in the middle of the village. When I knocked on the door, a young man opened it for me. He said that he and his wife moved in about a month earlier. He was a writer, and this place was perfect for him to work at his books. But there was something that made him and his wife scared to live there. They said that at night, they would always hear noises coming from the nearby woods, and that this ghost was making things around their home disappear. As we finished talking, I went for a walk. I walked around near the forest's edge, looking for anything strange. I found some wolf, deer, rabbit, and even fox prints, nothing special. But then I saw something rather strange. At one tree, there were large, deep scratches, sort of like a bear's. But there weren't bears at that part of the country. Just beyond that area, further into the woods, there was a small lake, so I figured an animal came to drink some water, and for some reason scratched up this tree, maybe to mark its territory. After a while, I came back to the village. I set up some cameras, hid some of them in the trees, put some sound recording devices and set them up at the base of their barn. I was sitting and watching the cameras, drinking on an energy drink, when suddenly I saw something strange on one of the cameras, like something crawled through the grass. It moved toward the house exiting the woods. I grabbed my knife and began to move toward the couple's house, where the unsuspecting couple was sleeping inside. At this point, I was thinking that this ghost is just someone kidding around. But that was a huge misunderstanding. I crawled to the end of the rooftop and started to observe the area. For a moment, I didn't see any movement. But then I finally saw it. It was indeed inhuman. It was a humanoid-looking animal, though. Its skin was pale, almost blue in a way. It looked skinny and starved, and it had very long fingers, not like claws or something, just normal, long fingers. It really did look like a person, but I knew it wasn't. Not after seeing the way it moved, the way its bones were shaped unlike ours. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I just stared at it. I'm glad it never saw me or felt my presence, otherwise I didn't know what I would do. As fast as I could, without making any noise, I got down from the roof and ran back to my little base. I grabbed a stick, poured some oil on it, and lit it. And then I rushed into the field. The thing was there, almost touching the wall of the house, about to crawl inside via the window. When it saw me, first it looked like it didn't expect to see anyone. Then it made a strange, long, drawn-out scream, then took off at full speed through the woods. And by God, it was fast. Just imagine how fast a cockroach is when it realizes you've seen it, and it tries to scurry away out of view at an instant, fast speed. That's what it reminded me of. It must have gone from 0 to 35 miles per hour. In the blink of an eye, it was back in the woods and it had vanished. I sighed with relief because I knew if it hadn't gotten scared of the torch, there was no way I could have taken it down. The next morning, I spoke to the owner of the property. I told him what I saw out there, that there are no ghosts involved. Both of us agreed that we can't leave it like that, but there wasn't much more that I could do there. So I just gave him some advice, like how to secure his home, set up traps and stuff like that. Then I left the place, a little unsatisfied with how we ended it, but a little relieved that I don't have to go back there. It was one of those cases I've never solved, and I'll always wonder what that animal truly was.
I am, and have always been, a very small girl, standing at 4'11", fully grown. I'm now 27. I've always been able to pass as being much younger than I actually am, especially if I don't wear makeup. When I was a small child of about 7 or 8, my father bought a little cabin in a town of Texas called Livingston. In the area of Livingston, there's another place called Onalska. That's where we were. The cabin was nothing remarkable at only 600 square feet. It was really just one giant room, a tiny kitchen the size of a normal bathroom, a bedroom the size of a closet, and a porch. Now the whole property consists of 2 lots, so there was plenty of space, but the cabin itself was dinky. The whole area was in a strange mix between backwoods and suburbia. It was a true neighborhood, but not the prim and neatly kept neighborhoods that I was used to in suburbia Houston. Despite this, it became a very fond place for me, and some of my greatest memories in life are at that place, including my evacuation story from Houston during Hurricane Rita, but that's for another day. Anyways, around 11 to 12 years old, my father brought me a 4-wheeler, and the little lake town suddenly became a lot bigger. I didn't go super far, but I definitely ended up going further than I was ever supposed to, or went before. It wasn't uncommon to see me zipping up and down the roads with a pile of neighborhood kids on the back of the 4-wheeler, where we would go up to the lake house on weekend visits. This was around 2001 to 2, so we did have cell phones, but it was common for people not to have them. Usually, I had a beeper thing that I carried around, with no phones at the lake house, my father giving me a walkie-talkie with a very long reach instead. Looking back on it now, from a world of cell phones, it seems like a really bad idea, but this was a small town, and we had spent much time there, and it felt like home and safe. So on one of these weekends, I was buzzing around my neighborhood like I usually did. I stopped at the peninsula to overlook the lake. This was a set of docks that kids always came to when they wanted to swim. Despite the very real threat of giant alligators, we still went there anyway. And I was overlooking the lake when my walkie-talkie buzzed to life. Naturally, I thought it was my parents trying to reach me. I answered it quick. I was unable to figure out exactly what they'd said at first, so try confirming that it was my dad. This went in the neighborhood. We're a little ways from the cabin, but I'd reached my parents from this point before. So despite the fact that I couldn't recognize the voice, I assumed it was my father. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but it was off enough that I remembered being slightly worried. I heard some questions. I did answer, but did it in a way that they wouldn't have been able to figure out who I was or what I was doing. Eventually, the conversation started to drift in a new way that I knew something was off. But I was not alarmed yet, as my dad was notorious for pulling pranks on me and goofing around. I kept on talking stupidly. Alarm bells were not going off yet. Finally though, The guy on the other end of the walkie-talkie made a comment. I cannot for the life of me remember what he said exactly, but it was enough to make me doubt that it was my father. This is when things took an extremely creepy turn. Bear in mind, I'd been talking to this guy pretending to be my dad for about 15 minutes now, sitting on my four-wheeler on this peninsula. I can see you. You should take a ride in my boat, he said. My father had a boat, but this was so out of character for him that it made me realise that it in fact was not my dad. Dad? You're not a dad, are you? What are you talking about? You can see me. I started to feel a bit worried. I then said, if you can see me, what am I wearing? The guy paused for a second, then the walkie-talkie came to life. He said very clearly, you're wearing an orange shirt, you have red hair, and you're sitting on a four-wheeler right by the swimming docks. Come and ride in my boat. At this point, my eyes widened and my blood ran cold. This entire time, some strange guy that I didn't even know had been watching me from God knows where. It took me maybe 10 seconds to look around wildly and then kick the four-wheeler up and race out of there so fast that I barely had time to get traction on the ground. I remembered the wheels span out against the gravel beneath them. When it finally started moving, I had little time to hold on. I floored it the entire way home. I stopped in the middle of the yard and burst into home. Obviously, the first thing I did was ask my parents if they had contacted me, which they said no, and they hadn't for hours. I was in such a panic and knew that there was no way my dad would have been doing this to me. I hate to think what might have happened had I continued sticking around that area. Now, nothing ever come of this incident though, and luckily, my childhood up there resumed as normal. Eventually the weekend visits stopped though, but the story doesn't end there. During my parents' divorce, I moved to live at a lake house permanently with my father, or at least until we could find something that was better. This was the only place that we could go when we left my mum. My father had recently suffered health issues. This meant that I had to take on a job myself at a nearby gas station / tobacco barn to pay bills and let him recover. Thankfully, the lake house had no bills saved for electricity, water and internet, so my small salary was enough to keep us going. I only had to work there for 3 months, but those 3 months were by far the most creepy thing that I've ever experienced. Within the first month of working there, a rather tall and obscene man became obsessed with me. He could not have been creepier. He had short crew hair and a slightly unkempt beard and weird moustache. The first time that we ran into each other, he stared at me with these crazy wild eyes and ordered his gas, and just stood there for the next 3 solid minutes staring. I did ask him a few questions, but he said nothing and just continued to stare at me. Now, the part of the tobacco barn that I worked in was strictly the gas side, and I was pretty much in a glass box with an opening to take people's money and give them cigarettes. Now, several times that this man came to visit, he would leave to pump his gas and stare at me awkwardly. After about the 5th time of this happening, I had enough and left to where he could not see me. Then, I saw his face pressed against the glass staring at me on the other side of the barn. He had this maniacal grin and was just waving at me with his fingers. It was enough to send me running for management until he left. Now, the last time that I saw him was an event that I'm never going to forget. It has been etched into my mind so deeply that I doubt bleach could scrub it away. He arrives like he normally does and orders his gas. This time, however, he reached through the hole in the glass and grabbed my hand before I could put cash away in the cash register. It wasn't a violent grab, but firm enough to keep me from pulling away. He just said that he really liked me, refusing to let go of my hand. I simply stared at him, unnerved, with alarm bells going off in my mind. "Say it," he said. "What? Say you love me." Naturally, I just wanted this guy to go away. Been so scared out of my mind at this point, I mimed it to him. He then said, "Call me if you need anything," gripping my hand even tighter. "What's your number?" he said again. This completely threw me off. I was already terrified enough, but I was too scared to even speak properly. I didn't want to give away my real number. I couldn't make up fake ones on the spot because of the fear. After stammering for a bit and saying that I didn't know, he said something that made my blood run cold. I felt like I was going to throw up. "It's 911. He winked at me. This guy was the sheriff's deputy. The person that I'd have to call if I was in any trouble in town. The person that I'd have to call if I had a medical emergency or if somebody tried to rob me. He wouldn't let go of my hand. I just nodded, trying to keep myself from shaking bad enough for him to feel it. He never even pulled up in a police car or anything. But when I talked to the manager, she confirmed to me that he was weird. Once he did let go of me and went on his way, I retreated to the back and demanded to be released from the gas station area. I didn't care. I did not want to see that guy again. Thankfully, we moved away soon, so I never had to, but I'll never forget the way that he stared at me, or what his intentions were. You'd think moving away would be the end of the story, but no, it got even worse when I went to college. And you wouldn't think that would be the case considering I live in Gladstone. I had needed to go to my counsellor to discuss a few things, and this usually involved about 30 minutes of chit-chat, as me and my counsellor had become close when I was attending school. During one of these chats, my father attended due to him attending school in the same classes that I was in an effort to finally get his degree. During this session, I mentioned Alaska, Texas, and how we had owned a lake house up there. Instantly, the happy expression left my counsellor's face. She informed me that she had been a social worker in that area for quite a few years. Apparently, the area was notorious for paedophilia, kidnappings, and other horrible incidents. Whole neighbourhoods, including police officers, were actually in on it. Apparently, it was possible for people who reported incidents to go completely missing. She proceeded to tell me of several cases that she had worked on, including incidents of entire families being in and out on a whole mess. When I told her about the sheriff I encountered, she kinda went pale and wouldn't tell me any more except that she wasn't surprised. The conversation went on for over an hour and a half, but it was enough to make me never want to turn into that small town again, and vow to never ever bring any children near there in the future.
Skinless Deer, submitted by Chelsey T. To begin, let me say I love scary stories. I love listening to them as I fall asleep, like many of us do. My significant other and I are eccentric, to say the least. We love nothing more than finding abandoned barns and farms and camping in and around them. Out in the woods, we never lose a wink of sleep, and as hunters/taxidermists, both of us have a vast knowledge of our local fauna. I should add that neither of us believe in the paranormal. Even after this sighting, we're very skeptical. One of our favorite hobbies is driving in the late hours of the night when nocturnal animal activity is at its peak. We scout the dirt roads that cross our delta. You can drive for over 50 miles in any direction and only ever see the occasional farm or maybe small game. That is fun for us, exploring the night, just the two of us and the dirt roads. It was around 1 a.m. We had our eyes fixed on the road, keeping a keen eye out for any eye shine of the typical possum or skunk. Suddenly, we see the eyes we are looking for. Instantly, I slow down, getting ready to see the critters that we always look forward to seeing at night. But as we near it, something is off. The eyes are much higher than usual, My headlights begin to cut through the darkness, revealing the animal. It's walking on the passenger side of the road towards our vehicle slowly. It seemed to be completely unfazed by us or the vehicle, and it was determined to continue walking towards us. As we got within a few car lengths of it, the details revealed themselves. It had some of the usual attributes of a deer or a goat, but it was slender, almost too skinny, like it was malnutritioned. It was taller than a coyote or a dog. Its feet came to points instead of paws. It had a small opening for a mouth, but there were things wrong about this creature. Very wrong. It was fleshy and pink and had no ears at all. It never blinked or even looked at us. Its snout was shorter than normal, giving it a much more rounded, semi-human shaped face. I heard myself say loudly, "What the hell is that?" As we began to pass it, my significant other turned his entire body to follow it. He kept its eyes locked on the strange thing. Noticing that he had also seen it, I responded in turn. "You saw that too? Let's check it out." We'd only made a few car lengths past the animal, and I could still see it in my rearview mirror. I quickly flipped the car around and raced us to the spot we had just seen it. We jump out, flashlights already in hand. Like I said, we look for game at night often, and have our night kit ready to go to observe animals we may stumble upon. We just didn't expect to see anything like this, not that night. No one ever does, I guess. We both were brazen, and have always joked that if we ever did see anything unexplainable, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, that we would track it down to discover what it truly was, instead of running away in fear. We quietly combed the very last spot we saw the thing, and despite both of us coming from hunting backgrounds, we cannot find any trace of any animal being on or near the road. We stand silently, listening for it, and hear nothing. It had vanished into the night. "What did you see?" I asked my significant other. "I guess it was a deer, but it looked like it didn't have skin," he answered. "That's what I saw too. Maybe it was hit by a car," I said, trying to piece together what it could have been. "Or I guess we saw the chupacabra," he joked, as we got back into the car and continued on our night adventure. We still drive by that spot a couple of times a year. Every time we do, the topic of that night never fails to pop up. I still don't have a clue what it was, but after hearing similar stories of other monsters, a part of me is wary when we do go out exploring. I don't really want to believe what I saw was supernatural, but there's no other explanation for it at this time. Be careful out there. You never really know what you'll run into.
This happened to my mum 3 years ago. I was away in university at the time, so I only heard about it after my mum and great uncle told me. Before I go on, a little background is necessary. I grew up in a small rural town. My family are apple growers. In fact, I'm the 7th generation of my family to grow up on the family orchard. Our property is located on a mountainside, and our orchids grow all the way up from the main road up to the thick woods. They cover the mountain. My neighbours are my grandparents on one side and my great aunt and uncle on the other. It all started on a sunny afternoon on a Sunday. As she usually does, my mum took her horse out for some exercise. She will usually ride all the way back up the woods until she reaches the old scout's cabin, and then back down past the sugar shack. On this particular day, she chose to come down the path that borders my great uncle's property. There's a large pond there where a heron lives. It's picturesque. Now as she looked towards the pond, she saw a hunched over figure shuffling along the trees. At first she thought it was probably Johnny, This was an affiliated nickname we gave to the old man my family would employ to help us around the farm. He was rather eccentric but harmless. Worried he might be injured, she began towards him. As she got closer, she remembered that Johnny had left the weekend before. It couldn't have possibly been Johnny. She continued towards a figure, wondering if it was perhaps a lost hiker. That's when the figure emerged from the trees onto the path. It was in fact a young man. It was hard to give him an age because his face was covered with rags. He was bare-chested, and his pale skin was covered in scratches and sores. My mum yelled out for him, but he didn't reply. She continued towards him, but then stopped suddenly. In his hand, dragged behind him, was an axe. Around his waist was a rope tied to a duffel bag dragging behind him. She felt very threatened at this point, and the horse had become spooked as well. She took a bit more distance from him and called out again, "Hey, are you okay?" Faint, incoherent grumbling come back as a reply. He wasn't even looking at her. She made a final attempt at contact with this guy, but again, he started making a weird sound, this time a loud gruntal yell. She told him to get off the property and directed him towards the main road. She rode back towards the house then, intending to call the police. Halfway there, she realised the path that he was taking would lead him in the direction of my great-uncle's house. My great-auntie is an avid gardener and was out doing gardening that day. She then turned the horse around and hightailed it to their house. Both my great-uncle and great-auntie were on the porch enjoying lemonade. She quickly told them what was going on and said that they had to go inside, lock the doors and call the police. My great-auntie did so. My great-uncle didn't want to though. He boldly declared, "I'm going to talk to him." But before my mum could say anything, he was in his truck and driving along the path. He intercepted him halfway up the path. He drove alongside him and rolled down the window. "Are you lost?" he said. The young man didn't look at him and instead kept on shuffling down the path. My great-uncle repeated himself. "With Dad in woods," was all my great-uncle could discern from this man's grumbling. "What's your name?" He replied, "Dad always liked animals." "Better now," was the reply. There was something incredibly unsettling about the young man's replies. My great-uncle, now sufficiently spooked, directed him towards the main road and drove back. When he came back to tell his story, the consensus was that there was probably a dead body in the woods. They called the police and waited. When the police arrived, the young man was nowhere to be found. They searched throughout the woods but didn't find anything. What they did find though was very unsettling. There were multiple incidences of hares and a skunk that had been hacked to bits and half eaten. They told my family to call them back immediately if anything else would happen. The following week in the local paper, there was an article about a mentally disturbed young man who was found along the side of a road in a town nearby. He had been missing for over 3 months and had run away from a halfway house. I never got any more details about him and never found out what else had happened.
The Forest of Shadows, submitted by Brad. I want to start this story by saying that I'm no stranger to weird or paranormal things, and this is the story of the beginning of that familiarity, and what started my obsession with things of the spiritual world. I'm 25 years old, and I'm from North Carolina, in a small town sandwiched between Charlotte and the foothills. We are 30 minutes away from the city, and 30 minutes away from the middle of nowhere. It's the perfect amount of urban to rural ratio. My parents have lived in the same house since I was 2 years old. It's at the end of a dead-end road surrounded by woods on all sides for a few miles. The story takes place around the age of 9 in 2001. My days would consist of going to school, coming home from school, getting one of my 2 friends that lived on the same road as us, and either playing on the road or hurting ourselves, or playing in the woods and hurting ourselves again. We played rough, what can I say? Not too long after this story took place, I almost lost my pinky finger via a skateboard, and I still sport a scar that wraps around my pinky, so needless to say, we were fearless. It was a normal day for me. Me and my mom just got back home from getting me from school. After grabbing a snack, I headed outside and decided to walk up to where my road and the main road would meet, and to get to my friend Jason's so we could go play. Shortly after getting to his door, his dad informed me that he was at his grandparents' house, and I would only be able to play by myself today. I was disappointed. I had nothing to do. You can only do so much by yourself, and there wasn't much in the way of doing in that neighborhood, and not really any other children close by, so I decided to find something to do. I walked through an area in the woods we called the Briar Wall. It was the woods surrounding my parents' house, and it was pretty open, except for one area that was next to impossible to get to, due to all the painful briars. I had explored our woods for the most part except for the giant area. I never knew if it was just briar bushes, or was it an open field. That place was still a mystery to me. I'd always wanted to see what was on the other side of those prickly bushes, and my inner explorer screamed to be set free, so I gladly obliged. I went back to my house to get supplies, because living close to the mountains, I'd heard of people getting stuck in the woods, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. Other times, they never came back out. So I got my backpack, put in some snacks, some water, a jacket, and matches. I even grabbed my pocket knife, and I snuck into my older brother's room to steal his machete. Yeah, a 9-year-old having access to a knife and a machete. It does sound dangerous and hard to believe, but this was the South, and my parents and brother had always taught me weapon safety since I was young. I even got my first knife when I was 7. Now on with the story. I walked into the woods and proceeded toward the Briar Wall. As I neared the wall of prickly pain, I recounted how my older brothers and sister told me how they never had been past the wall as well. So it felt more like an adventure now, like I was making the first step beyond the wall. I almost felt like Neil Armstrong or something. I was ready to see what was on the other side. So with that in mind, I began to cut my way through, and for 30 to 40 minutes I hacked away at the briars until I saw a hole. And being impatient, I took my jacket and put it over my face, and I ran through the briars. Some of them sunk into my flesh and pulled at my clothes, ripping them. It was painful, but my need to explore was much stronger than the stinging sensations. On the other side, I pulled out the stickers that broke off the vines and the ones that had stuck into my skin. After a moment or two, I resumed my course, undeterred. The trees in this part of the woods were massive and spaced far apart. At that time in my life, I knew nothing of the woods really, other than they were fun to play in. But from what I know now, I can tell you these trees were at least 100 years old. Each one was around 2.5 feet wide, and they were spaced 30 feet or more apart. Most of them were oak trees, white oak, ash, and poplar, which are super common here, but the age and sheer size of them was amazing to behold. I explored for hours and eventually found a creek that I began to follow, and soon I came upon a delta where the creek split and created a small island in the center. I thought this place was amazing, the perfect spot to set up a base for the next time I came back to the area. Next time I'd bring friends, and I'd show them and brag about all I had seen. I scrambled down one side of the bank, through waist-deep water, and up the other side of the bank. I set my pack and machete down and began to clear sticks and leaves from the ground when I saw something tan or white sticking up from the ground. I began to dig at the object until I pulled out a bone. There were more underneath. Now, being from the south, it's not uncommon to find piles of bones from hunters or just animals decaying in the woods. It intrigued me more than it freaked me out. I was curious to know what kind of animal it was that died, so I dug more. I began to dig and I found something that made my heart skip a beat. I kid you not, even at that age I knew. It was a skull, a human skull. This was something that horrified me. I dropped the skull and began to grab my stuff to leave. And that's when I saw something dark moving through the trees maybe 40 or so feet away. I was scared out of my mind, afraid that I was going to end up in the ground like this guy. I found somewhere to hide. I covered my pack with leaves and got down into the creek, and I backed up underneath the edge of the bank, which had an overhang. I watched as I saw something moving through the trees. It seemed almost like it was floating. It was human in shape, but blacker than black, almost like what you would think a black hole would look like. I'd never seen a spirit before, but I believed this was one, and it scared me more than anything I'd seen before. When it finally passed where I thought it wouldn't see me, I made a break for it. As soon as my feet left the water, it stopped and began to turn toward me. That's when I turned and ran. I looked back twice. It was behind me coming for me. Then I pushed through the briar wall. When I looked back the last time, before I got back out of the woods, it was gone. When I was finally out of the forest, the sun was starting to go down, and I had cuts and scrapes all over me due to my mad dash through the woods and briars. But I left the bag and machete, which made my brother mad at me, and of course no one believed my story, but I knew what I saw was real. Since then I found out that the land that my parents' house is on, and those woods, used to be a cow pasture back in the 1800s, where supposedly 2 men and a woman were killed. Later on in the early 1900s, dark ritual magic was reportedly done there in the 70s and 80s. Rumor has it people were burned at crosses there. I've had many more experiences in those woods and other places, but those are for another time. Needless to say, I tried my best to avoid that briar wall.
I thought I'd tell people a little background information. I'm an avid mountaineer and spend most of my weekends trekking the mountains and hills of South Wales. I've done this for over 15 years. Within that time, only twice have I ever felt genuinely concerned for my safety. Once I was confronted by a bull, and the other is the story below. It was a boiling hot Saturday afternoon about 5 years ago. I was doing one of my favourite walks, which was about 14 miles long. This particular area was mainly forestry, but the tracks themselves were gravel. There were no other walkers, only a few cyclists, which was kind of typical being so hot. So the first 9 to 10 miles were standard. I was at the bottom of a track that would eventually lead to the top of the valley. About 50 meters ahead, I could see a man walking in the same direction. He was tall, thin, had short cropped hair. He was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jeans and black boots. He walked with a very strange swing in his legs. It's kind of hard to describe, but almost as if one was shorter than the other. I didn't think much of it. He was actually walking quite fast, so I wouldn't have really been able to overtake him. I carried up on the track. The sun was overhead. It was sweltering. The man ahead kept on walking. I thought it was weird how much he was limping along, but nonetheless, he was making quick work of the incline. The track started to bend and I almost lost sight of him. The track comes up to a choice of two paths. East is the safest and leads to a small car park which is rarely used, and west leads to the top of the valley. I was about to go west when I heard the man shout out, "Crap." It was coming from within the forest. I waited a second for another outburst. No. My first thought was that he must have taken a cut while falling over or something. As I made my way through the thick trees and ferns to see what was up, I then stopped, dead in my boots. Up ahead through the trees, I could see the man. He was sat down on a log with his head in his hands. He then screamed at the top of his lungs, "No," again. He then bolted up and started punching a tree. He was furious. He then picked up a stick and bashed it against a tree. I was froze. I couldn't actually process what the hell was going on. He then shouted out, "I hate you," and kicked the bottom of the tree. I simply thought, I need to get out of here before he sees me. I then quickly made my way back to the track, careful not to fall over or make any loud sounds. This guy was clearly a lunatic. Now I thought to myself, I'm going to take the track that's rarely used eastwards, and then take a cut northwards through the ferns. This is probably the best way to avoid him. With every step, I become more confident and almost began laughing. Maybe he was a little bit off, or letting off some steam. The woods would be a perfect place for this, I suppose. After about 15 minutes, the ferns started to grow thick, and were finally at chest level. It wasn't a problem because they're fairly easy to push through. As I looked back, I could see him limping about 25 meters away. He's wadding through the ferns in the exact direction that I'm going. He had a strange snarl on his face and his head is bobbing up and down between the ferns. I couldn't believe what was happening. He must have seen me. There was no other explanation. I was only a mile away from the main road. I started to speed up and walk a bit quicker. I occasionally looked behind me and could see I was getting further and further away. Now I still don't know what to make of the situation, but the fact that he followed me silently through the ferns for that long was the most disturbing thing. I've done the same walk over a dozen times since and never seen him again.
Weird Things in My Woods. Submitted by Thos Phoenix. This past summer, in 2017, my fiancé and I began finding weird things in the woods outside of our house. We live in a condo complex in the northeast that is surrounded by woods with walking trails throughout. When the weather is nice, we spend a lot of time outside. My fiancé in particular has several fallen trees that she likes to sit on, and one particular spot that she likes to sit at. I think it's also important to point out that these woods border a pond that we also take our kayaks out on. The only people that we see walking through the woods are maybe 2 people that own dogs, and the occasional people that illegally park in our complex to go fishing or kayaking. We're out there every day for hours on end, when it's warm out at least. Now, the part of the path that we walk on a daily basis extends from this one entry trail to the main path in the woods, and extends down to the left to a beaver dam, then to the right to this clearing in the forest. The trails extend beyond these parts, and more often than not, we only walk the parts described above. One day during the summer last year, we noticed that someone had placed playing cards throughout the path. They were definitely not haphazardly thrown around. They were delicately placed next to fallen logs, nestled in tree branches, inside logs, and placed face up between varying plants along the path. These cards only extended as far as we usually walk, all the way down to the beaver dam to the left of the entry path, and to the right of the entry path by the clearing that I described. In the particular spot that she likes to sit at, we found 2 king cards and a jack perfectly propped up in the tree. Now, this particular spot is a little outcropping into the water from the path that has a tree in the middle, and unless you walk out into the outcropping, you wouldn't have been able to see the cards that were nestled in the tree. So whoever placed these cards also placed queen cards in each of the fallen trees that my fiancé likes to sit at. I have a disability with balance, so I never go on them, making them her spot. In the same outcropping, we found a blue rubber ball and an hourglass that had magnetic lodestone on the top of it. We have no idea what the purpose of these things were. We took the cards, the rubber ball, and the hourglass back to the house, and we put them in a bag. About a month or 2 later, when my fiancé was out of town doing an herbal training thing across the country, I made it a point to continually walk the woods and see if I found anything else suspicious. Sure enough, I found cards in her favorite spot again, now written on with Sharpie and a notebook-sized paper note. I was out there every hour patrolling the day before, so the note must have been left out there when I wasn't there. Maybe in the middle of the night, I don't know. I'll type up what I can make out of the note here, but some of it is difficult to read because of the handwriting, and also because I found it the day after it rained. To my dear friend who I love and care about so much, please take the time to undo all the things that have caused me pain through waiting to get out of this maze of the heart and battle. The mind no longer needs to suffer every time another heart goes astray, as needs wait upon the carnage of the battle. Peace waits and suffers with you along with those whom care in a truly meaningful way. No jokes know the answer to the trail, attempts to undo Father, for they have nodded again and again not by himself, for he has not undone by the reasons unknown to those who waited to save and help Father. Those who must find the way to save and or come to him without the interference and existence of any common oppositional group and individual, living to be again to reign or cause upheaval to one family and again, attempt to hear family and one people and children of one apart. The common oppositional group has tilled countlessly to return and be again but no longer are. Since art is the family of the beginning, and inborn of only myself and of the girls who love you, and family is important, and 2 little girls are also along with their real daddy and real father. The false parents who lied and are common of opposition and evil and hatred and folly, and no longer do exist and no longer get created to be again same with any common opposition, whom are the same enemies of all past moments, except those that ever had to do with truth, perfection, power, and all the things important then to the opposition only could exist for a short time. When reviewing and scanning all the things I found, I did find a second page of the note which I forgot about, so I'll try to write that here. Along the left side it says, "You all seem very friendly and beautiful." Along the top it says, "Just say friend, invite me in, or for auth e vaktlun." And on the other side of the note, he says more mindless things, along with referring to himself or themselves as the Lonely Walker. Several cards had also been thrown into the water near the clearing that is to the right of where we enter the woods. I hopped in my kayak, picked them up, and called the police about it. When a cop showed up, he took a look at the note and the cards and told me what he thought. The cards said things like, "Love you girls. If you need a friend to talk to and walk you to places that are fun to drive. You're so pretty. Call the number if you want a true friend. My words are my words, none can be true. I'll be watching and waiting." He said it was probably somebody watching us and was looking to make a friend, albeit creepily. But because the note and cards did not contain threats, there wasn't anything he could do, and he advised us to just be aware of our surroundings when outside. The cards also had a Latin phrase and a phone number on the back. The police officer called the phone number, but nobody picked up, even though whoever left the note and the cards had written to call the phone number if you need a friend to talk to, or something along those lines. There were Latin phrases as well. Ipse et ipse solus scit omne verum. Amor fortior est quam mors, omnia visit, amor ad infinitum oesus. Duenos infinitum, duenos nos adoramus quod celsitudinem. When I tried translating it, I got something like, he knows the truth and only the truth shall make you learn how to see it. To believe love is stronger than death. Love conquers the infinity. Good we know what highness experience, good infinity, good we know what highness. Nothing occurred after that. I mean that I didn't find anything further, but it still really creeps me out. My friend suggested that I put it up on Reddit and see what anyone thinks. If I can figure out how to upload the images of the note and cards, I'll do that as well. If anyone might know what it all means, I'm open to interpretation. It's all very weird. I'm wondering if there will be anything else out there this upcoming spring or summer, but I'm feeling a bit better about it, as I'm in the process of getting my pistol permit. Not that I'll be looking for something to happen, but at the very least, I'll be prepared.
In the summer of 2013, my friends and I went out to a lake for a long August weekend. We heard of a party that night about half an hour away from where we were staying and decided to meet up with some other friends who were also attending. Mostly everyone was drunk at this point. It was already 10 PM, and since I had only a couple of drinks through the day, I decided to drive one of the vehicles. Since there was 8 of us, so we had to take 2 vehicles, we loaded up the cars with the tents and booze since everybody planned on staying the night, and they went off. The drive started out pretty normal. We didn't exactly know where we were going, so relied on some cell phone GPS which didn't work very well in the cabin country. The vehicle that I was driving left about 15 minutes before the other one, because they were playing some frisbee game where you had to knock a bottle off a post and get some money or something. I'd been going out to the lake for my entire life at this point, but the fact that I had some crappy GPS connection, coupled with the headlights that were very dim, made a very challenging experience. We knew we weren't far from the party, but it was now evident that we were kind of lost. One thing about the area that we're in is that there are a lot of people around. There are stretches of road at night that you won't see another car on whatsoever, but there's always plenty of cabins nearby. The population of this area between the winter and summer changes from roughly 5,000 to 50,000. After a good amount of driving, we see a car ahead with its hazards on. We decided we were going to ask for directions. Not a good idea. We pull up beside the car, and I look over and see a guy who looked to be not much older than us, but then again it is harder to tell. Now this guy appeared to be in his mid-20s, with wide-framed glasses and shoulder-length hair under a mesh cap. He was just staring straight ahead into the distance. Hey buddy, you don't happen to know where Bruce Bend is, do you? We got into the party and got lost. No response. The guy just kept on looking ahead. You alright? I said to him. Yeah, just make your next left and it'll be right after that. Oh, thank you. Much appreciated. So we kept on going and realised that this guy has turned his hazards off and is following a distance behind us. A bit strange, but we didn't think much of it. We then make a left turn like the guide suggested onto a really rough and bumpy gravel road and took that for roughly 3 minutes. The road was really bad, but I could see the glow of headlights behind me. The first right was a dirt road, unmarked, that didn't go very far. We slowed down and debated turning around because it just looked so dodgy, but I'm glad we didn't. The guy was still following us, and we decided to peel out of there. He followed us right on our tail, literally the whole way back. Now we made it to the road, but there were no cabins, no identifying features, and no turns until we got to the very end. Some of the guys in the car wanted to pull over. There was 5 of us and one of them, but we figured that he might be absolutely nuts and have a weapon and try and kill us all. I kept on driving, hung right at the end of the road which led out to the highway. He finally stopped following us at that point, not moving as we sped off into the distance. We called the other car and they seemed to have a better GPS reception, so we told them where to go. The party was great, but that's a part of the night that still sits with us. I sure don't want to come across another car with its hazards on an unmarked lonely road. I have no idea what his intentions were. I'm just glad that I never found out what they actually were.
Something Among the Birch Woods. Submitted by Katerma. I live in eastern Finland, in a small city. Most of the cities here are like openings or holes in a forest, if you look at them down from the sky. In the Finnish folklore, there are many stories of forest creatures and spirits that guard the forests and lead people astray. There are even stories of forest shrouding, where some force confuses a person who is in the woods so that they get lost for years. Some say there is an upside-down world there, where all kinds of wondrous and scary ancient beings live. There are stories of people going into the forest shroud and making it out years later with odd stories to tell. There's this birch forest near my home. A black river streams through it and floods it in the spring. I usually walk the dog in there because I think it's beautiful. Pure birch tree forests aren't that common even in here, and the trees are quite old, some of them huge. Old, full of fungi, and twisted. Sometimes I take the kids there too. My daughter is very sensitive in a way. From an early age she's been seeing and talking to imaginary things, some of them which were odd. For example, my now past grandmother. My daughter, she never met her, but often talks to her and about her. One day when we were eating at our dinner table, she just stood up, looked out the window and burst into tears, crying, "Goodbye, Mama." That was the end of the imaginary friend that we thought was my grandmother. It's curious, because I think my daughter kind of reminds me of her too. One time during the day, when we were walking among the birch woods, my daughter creepily said to me there was somebody there. She said it was a dead horse named Lotta. She told me it was very old and lived out here. I laughed at her. I'm just used to these stories from her. I smiled and shrugged and laughed at them, but there was always this weird undertone to her stories. They were fantastic and imaginative, but eerily consistent, like an unconscious hint of a memory. I think she's a smart child with a good imagination, but when she cries at night and I walk into the room to find her sleepwalking and pointing at an empty chair in the middle of the room, it feels uncanny, like there's something between the lines. A couple of months ago, it was a full moon, and I was walking my dog at night. I was going for a walk in the birch forest. The moon painted the frost bluish. As I approached the forest, the birch trees rose from the frozen ground like these white, upside-down ruins, and behind them, just black with hints of more white sides of the trees. It must have been like 100 meters away. I must have been 100 meters away from the house when I heard something from the dark forest. Something heavy was moving around in there, crashing through the trees. Sometimes I've heard the rabbits scream in there when a lynx or a fox gets them. The rabbits scream like a small child when they're being killed. But this was something different. A wild boar, maybe a moose. The dog was also interested in the sounds, its ears pointed upwards towards the sky. We walked closer to the white trees and the noises got louder. We both stopped to look. The dog didn't bark, it just pointed its nose towards the sound. As we walked back and made it to about 20 meters away from the tree line, the sounds stopped. For a while, it was just quiet, and then it started again. Something began running in the forest near the tree line, not from us, but towards us. It gives me chills just remembering this, heavy, amazingly fast footsteps. I start to think it was bipedal, according to the sounds it made. It made 20 to 30 meters in only a few seconds. I sat there frozen on uneven forest ground. I looked between the trunks over fallen trees and bushes, thinking, this isn't a human being at all, and it's definitely no moose. My dog's head turned accordingly to the movement as we heard it. And then it stopped, right before us. I felt the darkness staring at me, and I stared back. For sure, I wasn't going in the forest with something in the dark facing towards us. Just to the left of the path I was going to walk to enter the forest, making sounds in front of us, I started to back away from the tree line, never facing away from the sounds. Whatever was in there, it was interested in us, but didn't seem to want to come out of the forest. I wasn't about to turn my back to it, that was for sure. My hands curled into fists. The dog's tail was between its legs as we backed away. The sounds kept going, and I could hear them even from over 100 meters away. It was then that I turned my back on it and began to walk faster. I thought of all the possible forms the darkness could have taken in there if I'd went in, or if I had a flashlight with me. The terror I felt that night was more real than I'd ever felt before. I rushed home and locked the door. Even my wife got nervous seeing me spooked like that. I've been in the forest almost every night since then, walking my dog as usual, but we haven't heard anything like it since. I've always been on high alert since that night. Wondering about what was in there that night might just be better than having found out. I've never seen or heard anything move so fast in the forest before, but then I think of the dead horse my daughter said she saw. I know little children see things, but I also know their interpretations of them might be incorrect. They see more than us adults who have learned to see the world around us in a certain way, but therefore lacking the ability to describe it. Maybe she didn't see a dead horse after all, but something that she couldn't describe in any other way. Maybe a forest spirit from the ancient times, maybe a keeper that sometimes plays games and tricks on those who come into its domain. Or maybe I entered the forest shroud and was close to never returning.
My friend Lily has a cabin on a lake in WA, and one summer she brought me and her cousin Evan. It had been a great couple of days, and on the last night we went fishing at the lake. About a 5-minute walk away from her cabin. It was about 7 PM and the fishing was perfect at that hour. To get to the beach, you had to walk through a small section of woods. There was a trail down the middle that during the day was occupied by either joggers or children going to the beach. To get to our beach though, you had to go through a small section of woods that had no trail to it. Our beach was much more secluded. The hill down was steep and slippery, and the way back took a lot of climbing. We stayed at that beach until about 8:30, just sitting in the dark. We were mostly good kids and just sat on the log chatting. It was one of those weird situations where suddenly you look around and realise how dark it is. I told Lily and Evan that we should probably get going home. They agreed. We packed our gear. This was the latest that we'd ever stayed out at the beach, so to my overactive imagination, something bad was going to happen. We calmly and silently for some reason walked up the hill. I told them that it was pretty creepy here at night. Evan then made it 100 times worse. He told us of a story about mountain men who had been living here in around the 60s and basically were just a cult. He said that they murdered people all over the area for their cult activities. I was very scared, telling him to shut up. As we started to cross the trail, Evan looked to our right for some reason. He stopped, dead in his tracks, and looked scared. Lily told him to stop being stupid. The both of us then started up the steepest part of the hill. Evan grabbed us both by the arm very forcefully and made us look to where he was looking. At first, I couldn't see anything and just wanted to get home, but then my eyes adjusted and I saw a large man. He was stumbling towards us at a slow pace. Who knows what his intentions were, but being kids, we were freaked out and scrambled up the hill as fast as we possibly could. We all turned around at some point and saw that the dude was running towards us while we climbed. He got pretty close to us until we finally got over the hill and sprinted across the road to the cabin. It sounds fairly innocent, but we all had a deep feeling of dread when we saw him on that trail. I'd know that his intentions were not good. Once we got to the cabin, we threw our gear on the porch and ran to the front door. It was not open. Luckily, there was a secret knock that her family had shown them that they could use so they could be sure it was a family or friend visiting. It was a fairly complicated ribbon, and both Lily and Evan banged on the door to the family knock. I don't know why you can't just look out a window. I just looked around trying to see if the creep had followed us, but saw nothing. We were let in and in a panic told the adults the whole story. They said it was probably just some guy who probably made me feel bad, but we disagreed and felt safe in the locked cabin with the grown-ups. The cabin had a walkout basement. Basically, like a lower story, not a creepy basement, it had a door and windows, where Lily and I slept on our bunk beds. Now after about 5 minutes of calming down together, we heard the family knock. I thought it was Evan trying to come in from the stairway door, so I said, "Come in." No response. It happened again, but this time we realised where it's coming from. It's the outside window. Lily and I turned completely white at this point and just stared at each other with that horrible feeling of terror in our stomach. It then happened again, but a little more frantically. We both ran to the stairway door and booked it up the living room where Lily's family and Evan were. We told them all what we had heard through our panic state, and Evan went downstairs to listen. He said it is definitely the knock. While Lily's uncle, older brother and older cousins all gathered flashlights to go look outside, we then heard it again, but on the front door. Everybody looked to the door and huddled together. It happened once more, then again, and Lily's uncle decided to call the police. He said, "I'm not sure what their intentions were, but somebody's trying to break into my cabin." The knocking went on for another 2 minutes or so, and it finally stopped. 5 minutes after the call went out, the police showed up to the door and yelled "police" through the door. To make sure, Lily's uncle looked outside a window and saw other police searching around for the creeper. The police then said that we had to tell them what had happened in the woods too. They didn't seem too bothered by this and didn't think much of it, but what creeped me out was the fact that somebody had memorized a complicated family knock, and who had been that far out in the woods alone? Had they followed us back? Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to say a big thank you to my friend Darkness Prevails for featuring on this video. Make sure you check out his channel after watching this video. Thank you again buddy for featuring. I have a question for you guys. What's the most scary thing that's ever happened to you in the woods or in the middle of nowhere?